Hello, today we're going to take a look at the recently released MCP server for Trade Server. I'll show you a few practical use cases, but there are many more ways it can make day-to-day work easier if you're working with Trade Server as an administrator, dealer, risk manager, or in another operational role. This is my Claude desktop application. I'll use Claude to interact with Trade Server through MCP and make some changes. And this is Trade Server itself. This is the admin UI, which we'll use throughout the demo to check the configuration and verify the changes Claude makes. Let's start with something that can be particularly annoying: adjusting trading sessions for symbols when daylight saving time changes. Different brokers handle DST differently. Some adjust their sessions when both Europe and the US switch their clocks. Others keep their server aligned with New York DST and therefore only need to make changes when Europe switches. Doing this manually across a large number of symbols can take a lot of time. Here, I only have a small test environment with some Forex symbols, cryptocurrencies, and a few indices. But now I can simply ask Claude to adjust the trading sessions according to the current DST settings. And that's it. That's all I need to ask. Claude connects to Trade Server through MCP, requests the current configuration, checks and compares the existing settings, works out what needs to change, and then presents its suggested adjustments for confirmation. For this demo, I'm using Opus 5 with a lower reasoning effort just to keep things faster. For this type of task, that should be more than enough. Now you can see that Claude has pulled the configuration from Trade Server and worked out the required adjustment by itself. Importantly, it doesn't just make the change immediately. It shows us what it intends to do and asks us to confirm the decision. Let's verify that with USD. The current session starts at 11 p.m. on Sunday, and my Trade Server time zone is Europe Helsinki. Based on the current DST configuration, the sessions need to move 1 hour forward. Claude also asks us which symbols we want to update. For this example, we'll select 5 symbols and proceed. Once the change is complete, Claude gives us a report showing what was done and whether anything still needs our attention. We can then go back to Trade Server and verify the result. Looking at USD again, the session now starts at midnight on Monday and runs through to midnight on Friday. And this isn't only useful for DST changes. You can also use MCP to review your existing symbol configuration and make sure everything is correct. For example, if your liquidity provider gives you a file containing the required trading sessions for a list of symbols, you could upload that file to Claude and ask it to compare those requirements against your current Trade Server configuration and identify or apply any necessary changes. So DST changes are just one example of how MCP can simplify repetitive Trade Server configuration. Let's look at another example. I have a text file stored locally containing connection credentials from a liquidity provider. Because I'm using Claude Desktop, I can simply ask Claude to check that file and use the information inside it. So I can say something like, check this file. It contains credentials from an LP. Can you add another liquidity provider? If we look at the current Trade Server configuration, we only have the existing connection sessions. Claude reads the information from the file, checks the current configuration, and then prepares the new connection. Again, it gives us the available options and asks for confirmation before proceeding. Now, if we go back into Trade Server, we can see that a new connector has been created. In this example, it's the TSEMA connector. It has been created in a disabled state, so we can review the configuration first and then enable it manually when we're ready. Creating this manually isn't necessarily a very difficult task, but this shows another way MCP can reduce repetitive configuration work. Another useful example is commissions. Imagine a broker has hundreds of groups, let's say 500, and you need to apply or review commission changes across all of them. Doing that manually using exports, Notepad, Excel, or similar tools can quickly become a nightmare. Instead, we can ask Claude to work with those groups directly. For example, we can ask it to identify every group where a commission is already configured and add an additional commission of $1 per lot. Claude first checks the current configuration. It sees that commissions already exist and asks us exactly how we want the new rule to be applied. In this case, we don't want to replace or increase the existing commission. We want to add a second commission rule of $1 per lot. We confirm that instruction and Claude prepares the changes. You'll also notice that if there are unresolved decisions from something we asked it to do earlier, Claude can bring those back to our attention instead of simply ignoring them. Now let's check one of our test groups. Under commissions, we can see the original commission of $3 per lot, and we can also see the new $1 per lot commission that Claude has created using the same configuration structure. And if you have more advanced requirements, you can simply describe those requirements to Claude in more detail. MCP can also interact with trading functionality. For example, let's ask Claude to place a test trade using one of our test accounts. The trade itself isn't really the main point of this example. What I want to demonstrate is how useful MCP can be when you need to investigate something in the trade server journal and logs. When something goes wrong, analyzing the journal manually can take a lot of time. If you have many clients trading simultaneously, even a single minute of activity could generate thousands or potentially tens of thousands of log lines. And usually you're not interested in all of them. You're trying to understand what happened to one particular trade account or group of trades. With MCP, you can describe the problem directly to Claude. You can tell it what the client is complaining about, provide the relevant trade or account information, and ask it to investigate. Claude can then search through the relevant trade server information and produce a report explaining what happened. It may also be able to identify a configuration issue that contributed to the problem. For example, imagine a client says their commission was charged incorrectly and that client has 10,000 trades. Instead of manually checking those trades one by one, you could ask Claude to investigate. It can review the commission settings, examine the relevant trades, check what was actually charged, and explain why the result occurred. Back to our test trade, Claude asks us for confirmation before proceeding. It can recognize that placing a trade is a more sensitive operation and therefore requires approval before executing it. In this example, the first attempt is rejected. Claude then investigates the result and works out why the trade was rejected. Eventually, we can see that a position has been successfully created on our test account. Claude was initially unable to place the trade using Bitcoin, so because we hadn't specified the exact instrument we wanted, it selected another available instrument. It also gives us a report explaining why the Bitcoin attempt didn't work. From there, we could review the explanation, investigate further, or ask Claude to adjust the relevant configuration if needed. Let's look at another administrative task, creating holidays. We can simply ask Claude, can you create holidays for the Forex symbols until the end of the year? Notice that we haven't even told Claude exactly which holidays or which dates to use. We're asking it to determine the standard Forex market holidays itself. Of course, in a real environment, you could also provide Claude with the official holiday schedule supplied by your liquidity provider or another trusted source and ask it to work from that. For standard Forex holidays, however, Claude can determine the expected dates and propose the configuration. It then shows us the proposed holidays before anything is created. We can review those suggestions and tell it to proceed. Rather than creating a separate holiday configuration for every individual symbol, we can also apply the configuration using symbol masks where appropriate. During this example, Claude runs into some difficulties with my test configuration, but instead of immediately stopping, it attempts to understand the issue and work through it. My test environment is a little unusual because most of the symbols are grouped under Forex, so I can tell Claude to apply the configuration across all of those symbols. Once it has finished, we can go back into Trade Server and see that the holidays have been created. Claude may still ask us about additional symbols or configurations that require a decision, but for the purpose of this demo, we can leave those aside. The final example I want to show is more relevant to risk management and client analysis. Through MCP, you can request Trade Server data and ask Claude to analyze it in the format you need. For example, we can simply ask, can you find the profitable clients? Claude queries the relevant Trade Server data and returns the accounts that meet that criteria. In our test environment, we can see that one of the demo accounts has generated a profit along with Claude's explanation of the result, but this is only a very simple example. You could request much more detailed information, combine different criteria, analyze the results further, or ask Claude to structure the output in whatever format is most useful for your workflow. There is one important thing to keep in mind when using MCP. MCP is still requesting data from Trade Server. Underneath the natural language interface, those requests are being sent through the Trade Server API. So you still need to think about the amount of data you are requesting and the load those requests create. For example, imagine you have 1 million accounts and 100 million trades. You should not repeatedly ask MCP to return the entire dataset 5 times per second. You could overload Trade Server with those requests, and because this is also running locally, you could potentially overload your own machine as well. Claude has safeguards and should recognize when a request involves an unreasonable amount of data. In those situations, it may suggest retrieving or analyzing the information in smaller portions instead. But it's still important to understand what is happening underneath MCP and use it responsibly. Those are just a few examples of what you can do with the MCP server for Trade Server. There are many more possible use cases depending on whether you're working in administration, dealing, risk management, or another brokerage operations function. That's it for today. Thank you.